My wife died. She pulled me close with the last real strength she had left, and she whispered 5 words into my ear that I didn't understand until it was almost too late. Don't trust our son, Walter. Thought it was the morphine talking. I thought grief and fear and 40 pain medications a day were scrambling her thoughts, the way they sometimes do at the very end. I squeezed her hand and told her everything would be fine, that our son loved her, that she didn't need to worry about anything except getting some rest. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen only twice before in 44 years of marriage. Once when the doctor first said the word stage 4, and once, decades earlier, the night our son was arrested at 19 for something I'd convinced myself was just a youthful mistake. It was the look of a woman who knew something and didn't have the strength left to argue about it. She died 2 days later, and it took me another 4 months to understand exactly what she'd been trying to tell me. My name is Walter. I'm 76 years old, and this is the story of the warning I dismissed as my dying wife's confusion, and the son who spent those 4 months proving her right in ways I never could have imagined. If you've ever had someone you love try to warn you about something you weren't ready to hear, stay with me until the end, because I promise you, this story does not end where you think it will. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back, not to the hospital room, to decades earlier, when this story actually started taking shape, long before either of us understood what we were raising. My wife's name was Evelyn. We were married 44 years, and for most of them, I would have told you we had the kind of marriage people write books about. Not because it was easy, but because we always told each other the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. Evelyn was a nurse for 31 years. The kind of nurse who could read a room, read a chart, read a person's face, and know things they hadn't said out loud yet. It was a skill that served her well in every part of her life, including, I would eventually learn, in reading our own son. Our son Michael was born when Evelyn and I were both 26. I won't pretend he was an easy child. He was strong-willed from the very beginning, the kind of boy who tested every rule, not out of malice, but out of some deep need to understand exactly where the edges of the world actually were. Evelyn used to say he had main character energy, before that was even a phrase people used. Always the center of every room, always certain his version of events was the correct one. At 19, he was arrested for check fraud, a scheme involving a summer job, a co-worker's stolen checkbook, and about $11,000 that took the local police department almost 3 weeks to fully untangle. I remember sitting in that police station at 2 in the morning, and I remember the conversation Evelyn and I had in the car afterward, the two of us parked outside our own house, unable to go inside yet. He's not a bad person, I told her. He made a mistake. Young people make mistakes. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Walter, she finally said, I've spent 30 years watching people lie to themselves about the people they love. I need you to promise me we're not going to become people who do that about our own son. I promised her, and for the most part, over the following decades, I believed I'd kept that promise. Michael straightened out, or seemed to. He went to community college, got a business degree, started a series of ventures, a landscaping company that lasted 2 summers before he lost interest, a used car lot that limped along for 3 years before quietly closing, eventually a small property management business that, as far as I understood, did reasonably well. Each time one venture ended, he had a story ready for why it hadn't been his fault. A business partner who'd mismanaged things, a market downturn, bad timing, always something external, never quite a pattern he was willing to examine in himself. I believed every version, one after another, the way you believe the same magician's trick every single time, because you want so badly for the coin to actually be gone. He married a woman named Priya, a soft-spoken pediatric physical therapist who Evelyn adored from the very first dinner the four of us had together, saying afterward that Priya was too good and too honest for what she's about to sign up for. A comment I brushed off at the time as typical mother-in-law overprotectiveness. They had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both of whom called me Grandpa Walt, and spent summers at our lake house, learning to fish off the same dock where I'd taught Michael, decades earlier, patience I apparently hadn't managed to fully pass down. By every outward measure, Michael seemed to have become exactly the responsible adult Evelyn and I had hoped for. But there was a pattern I chose not to look at too closely over the years. Michael was always, somehow, in need of money at exactly the moments Evelyn and I had some to give. A temporary cash flow issue with the property management business, a bridge loan for a car lot expansion that never quite materialized into the profits he'd projected, a down payment on a house that Priya, I learned much later, had actually opposed buying, feeling it was more than they could truly afford. Every time, Evelyn would express hesitation, and every time, I would find a reason to overrule it. He's our son, Evelyn. What's the point of having savings if we can't help our own child when he needs it? She never fully argued the point, but I remember, more than once, the particular quiet she'd go into after one of these conversations. Not agreement, exactly. Something closer to reluctant surrender. Over 20 years, we loaned Michael, by my own rough calculation done much later, somewhere close to $230,000. Almost none of it was ever repaid in full, though he always had a reasonable-sounding explanation for the delays, and I always accepted it, because that's what I'd decided being a good father meant. I kept a mental ledger of it for a while, in the early years, jotting amounts in the back of an old checkbook register, but I stopped somewhere around year 12, telling myself that counting it too closely felt like keeping score against my own son, and what kind of father does that? Evelyn, I learned much later, had never stopped counting. She simply stopped telling me the total out loud. Evelyn's cancer diagnosis came 3 years ago. Pancreatic, the particularly aggressive kind, caught later than any of us would have wanted. In the 18 months between diagnosis and the final decline, something shifted in how she looked at Michael. And at the time, I attributed it to illness, to exhaustion, to the particular clarity that sometimes comes with facing your own mortality. She started asking pointed questions whenever Michael visited. How is the business really doing, Michael? Not the version you tell people at parties, the real version. He'd laugh it off, tell her not to worry about things like that while she was sick, change the subject to something easier. I remember thinking, at the time, that she was being harder on him than the circumstances called for, that a dying woman shouldn't spend her limited energy interrogating her own son about his finances. I even pulled her aside once after one of those exchanges and gently suggested that maybe she was letting the illness make her more suspicious than she needed to be, that stress does strange things to how we see the people we love. She looked at me for a long moment, tired in a way that went far beyond the chemotherapy, and said only, "Walter, I have spent my whole career watching families lie to each other in hospital rooms. I know exactly what I'm looking at. I didn't push further. I wish, now, that I had pushed further in the other direction, toward her, toward whatever she was seeing. That I still couldn't. I understand now that she wasn't interrogating him out of harshness. She was trying, in the only way her failing body still allowed, to protect me from something she could see coming, and I refused to. About 4 months before she died, during one of her better weeks, Evelyn asked me to help her update our will and our medical directives. Reasonable, given the circumstances, and I didn't think much of the specific changes at the time, beyond trusting her judgment, the way I always had. What I didn't fully register, in the fog of that period, was that she'd also asked our attorney, a woman named Susan Chen, who'd handled our affairs for almost 15 years, to add a specific clause to my own power of attorney documents, one requiring a second signature from Susan's office directly for any transaction over $20,000, effective immediately upon Evelyn's death. I signed it without reading every line as closely as I should have. I want to be honest about that. I was watching my wife of 44 years disappear in front of me 1 week at a time, and paperwork felt like the least important thing in the world. 3 days before she died, in a rare moment of clarity between medication doses, she pulled me close and whispered those 5 words. "Don't trust our son, Walter." I told you already what I did with that warning. I dismissed it as confusion, as fear, as a dying woman's mind playing tricks on her. I held her hand and told her everything would be all right. She looked at me with that expression I mentioned, knowing and exhausted, and out of time to convince me of anything more. She died 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with the autumn light coming through the hospital window in a way I still can't fully describe without my voice breaking. I want to tell you about the 4 months that followed, because this is where Evelyn's warning stopped being confusion and started becoming the truest thing anyone had ever told me. Michael was, in those first few weeks, exactly the son I needed him to be. He helped with the funeral arrangements. He sat with me at the house so I wouldn't be alone in those first unbearable nights. He seemed genuinely to be grieving his mother as deeply as I was grieving my wife, and I let myself believe, in my exhaustion, that whatever Evelyn had sensed in those final days had simply been the illness talking after all. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Michael started bringing up practical matters, gently at first. Whether I'd thought about downsizing the house, now that it was just me in 4 bedrooms. Whether I'd looked at consolidating some of my investment accounts to simplify things during a difficult time. He mentioned almost in passing that his property management business had an opportunity coming up, a multi-unit acquisition that could really set the family up if only there were a bit more capital available quickly. I told him I'd think about it. And here's where I need to be honest with you about something important. Some part of me, the exhausted, grieving part, wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to hand him whatever he needed just to feel useful again, just to feel like being a father still meant something in a world that suddenly felt unbearably empty. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, but present, kept hearing Evelyn's voice. Don't trust our son, Walter. I called Susan Chen, our attorney, mostly to ask about the logistics of a large transfer, still telling myself I probably would go through with it. Susan was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she said something that changed the entire trajectory of what happened next. "Walter, before we discuss the transfer, I need to tell you something Evelyn asked me to hold until the right moment. She came to my office alone about 5 months before she passed, without telling you. She'd hired a forensic accountant to review Michael's business finances." I sat down. I don't remember deciding to sit down. I just remember suddenly being in a chair. Susan explained. Evelyn, in the final year of her life, sick and exhausted and running out of time, had spent some of her remaining energy quietly investigating the son we'd been loaning money to for 2 decades. What she'd found, according to the accountant's report sitting in Susan's files, was a business that had been functionally insolvent for almost 4 years, kept alive not by genuine growth, but by a rotating cycle of loans from Evelyn and me, a second mortgage on Michael's own house that Priya apparently didn't fully know about, and, in the final year, increasingly aggressive, borrowing from a private lender, charging what the report described as predatory, near-criminal interest rates. "She was building a case," Susan said quietly. "Not to punish him, to protect you. She knew that once she was gone and you were alone and grieving, you'd be more vulnerable than you'd ever been to exactly the kind of request Michael was likely to make. She asked me to hold this report and only share it with you if you called about a transfer over a certain amount. She made me promise not to bring it up otherwise, because she didn't want you to spend your last months with her looking at your own son with suspicion. She wanted you to have peace for as long as you could have it." I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that phone call. The same kitchen table Evelyn and I had eaten breakfast at for over 40 years. And I finally understood the full weight of those 5 whispered words. She hadn't been confused. She'd been protecting me with the very last clear thoughts she had left in her. Choosing, even then, to shield me from grief on top of grief for as long as she possibly could. I didn't confront Michael immediately. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I needed to understand the full picture first, not react out of the raw hurt of feeling deceived by my own son, on top of everything else I was already carrying. Susan and I spent the next several weeks reviewing the forensic report in detail, sitting across from each other at her conference table more evenings than I can count, going through bank statements and loan documents until the numbers started to blur together. Susan had known Evelyn for 15 years, had drafted her will, had sat with both of us through countless small pieces of our shared life, and I could see in the careful, deliberate way she walked me through each document that she was trying to protect me from being overwhelmed all at once. The same instinct Evelyn had trusted her enough to lean on in those final months. She didn't want to burden you while she was still here, Susan told me one evening, closing a folder gently. She wanted you to have this in pieces from someone steady once you were ready to actually hold it. What emerged was worse than even Evelyn's initial findings had suggested. The multi-unit acquisition opportunity Michael had pitched me wasn't a new investment at all. It was, according to the private lender's own paperwork that Susan's investigator managed to obtain, a balloon payment coming due on an existing loan, one Michael had taken out 18 months earlier against properties he didn't fully own, using documentation that, in at least 2 instances, appeared to have been altered. If I hadn't called Susan first, if I'd simply written the check the way exhausted, grieving fathers so often do, that money wouldn't have gone toward any acquisition. It would have gone toward keeping a collapsing, possibly fraudulent business alive for another few months, delaying an inevitable collapse that would have taken far more than money down with it when it finally came. I asked Susan to arrange a meeting. Not a confrontation, not yet. I wanted first to hear whatever Michael had to say for himself, in case there was an explanation I hadn't considered, in case some part of Evelyn's suspicion and my own new understanding was somehow incomplete. We met at Susan's office, the three of us, 4 months and 6 days after Evelyn's funeral. I remember the date exactly, because it was the day I finally understood what my wife had spent her last strength trying to protect me from. I laid out what I knew. The insolvency going back 4 years. The second mortgage Priya didn't know about. The predatory lender. The altered documentation on properties he didn't fully own. Michael's face went through the same slow collapse I imagined mine had gone through on that phone call with Susan. Shock. Then a kind of desperate scrambling for an explanation. Then, finally, something that looked almost like relief. The exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a secret so heavy for so long that even its discovery feels, in some strange way, easier than continuing to hide it. "Dad," he said, "I was going to fix it. I swear I was going to fix it before you ever had to know any of this. I just needed a little more time, a little more capital, and it would have worked out. I really believed it would have worked out." "Your mother knew," I said. "She knew for months, while she was dying. And she chose to carry that alone so I wouldn't have to carry it while I was losing her." I watched something break in my son's face at that. Not at the exposure of the fraud itself, I think, but at the realization of exactly what his mother had done. Protected him from consequences, protected me from additional grief, carried the full weight of a truth neither of us was ready for, alone, in her final months, because she loved us both too much to let either of us collapse under it at the same time. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, because the ending here isn't as simple as a courtroom scene or a dramatic confrontation. Susan and I worked with a different attorney, one specializing in fraud recovery, to protect what remained of my assets, and to help Michael's private lender situation from spiraling into something that could have taken down not just his business, but potentially his marriage, his house, everything Priya and the kids depended on. It wasn't out of blind forgiveness. It was because Evelyn's entire final act had been about protection, not punishment. And I found I couldn't fully abandon that instinct, even while I was still furious. There was one meeting, about 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, where I finally told Michael everything about that whispered warning at Evelyn's bedside. The exact words, the way I'd dismissed them, the 4 months I'd spent believing my own wife had been confused in her final days, rather than clear-eyed for perhaps the first time in years about what our family had allowed to grow unchecked. He put his head in his hands at that kitchen table, the same table Evelyn and I had eaten breakfast at for 4 decades, and he stayed like that for a long time before he spoke again. "She never said a word to me," he finally said. "Not once in all those months did she ever let on that she knew. She just kept asking those questions over and over, giving me chance after chance to tell her the truth myself. And I kept lying to her, right up until the end. I lied to my own dying mother because I was too ashamed to tell her I'd failed." "She wasn't asking so you'd confess to her, Michael," I said. "She was asking so that when she was gone, I'd already have some instinct not to trust the story you were about to tell me. She was trying to plant something in both of us at the same time, and she ran out of time before either of us fully understood what she was doing. Priya found out everything, of course. She had to, given how directly her own house was tied up in it. She and Michael separated for a period of about 5 months, and I watched my son, for the first time in his adult life, face real consequences without a parent quietly absorbing them for him. He sold the property management business, at a loss, to settle the worst of the debts. He took a job, an actual salaried job, the first one he'd held since his 20s, managing operations for someone else's company instead of running his own. It's been just over a year now since Evelyn died. Michael and Priya are back together, working through things slowly, with a marriage counselor, and I understand a great deal more honesty between them than existed before any of this came to light. He still calls me every Sunday, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, the calls aren't leading anywhere except toward an actual conversation. No requests, no careful setups, no gentle mentions of opportunities that always seem to require exactly the amount of money I happen to have available. Sometimes we just talk about the grandkids, or a book he's reading, or nothing important at all. And I've come to understand that those unremarkable Sunday calls are worth more to me now than any amount of money he could ever hand back. He also started, on his own, something I never asked him to do, meeting with a financial counselor every other week, the kind who specializes in what she calls recovery patterns for people who've built years of behavior around borrowing their way out of consequences. He told me about it almost sheepishly, the way you tell someone about a habit you're embarrassed to have needed help with in the first place. And I told him I thought his mother would have been prouder of that phone call than of any business he ever could have built successfully on his own. There's one more piece of this I want to tell you, because I think it matters more than anything that happened in Susan's office. About 2 months after Michael and Priya separated, before they'd started the slow work of coming back together, I got a call from Priya herself, late on a Sunday evening. She'd found, going through old files while sorting out the mortgage paperwork, a folder of letters Evelyn had written her over the years. One letter, dated about 6 months before the diagnosis, was addressed simply, "For Priya, if she ever needs it." In it, Evelyn had written about her own worries regarding Michael's pattern with money. Gently, without cruelty, but honestly, the same honesty she'd always insisted on with me. She'd written that she hoped Priya would never need to read it, but that if things ever became difficult, she wanted Priya to know she wasn't alone in seeing what she was seeing, and that she wasn't imagining things, and that leaving, if it ever came to that, would never make her any less loved by the family she'd married into. Priya read parts of that letter to me over the phone, her voice breaking every few sentences, and I sat in my kitchen with tears running down my face, understanding all over again just how much of the truth my wife had been quietly holding, and how carefully she'd tried to distribute the weight of it to exactly the people who could handle it, in exactly the doses they could handle it in, for as long as her body allowed her to keep doing that kind of careful, loving work. I think about that letter almost as often as I think about those 5 whispered words. Don't trust our son, Walter. She'd given me the shortest possible version because she knew, better than anyone, exactly how much I could absorb in that hospital room in those final days. She'd given Priya something longer, gentler, written in advance for a day she hoped would never come. She managed somehow, even while dying, to protect every person in this family according to exactly what each of us needed. And I don't think I fully understood the scope of that love until months after I'd lost her. I visit Evelyn's grave every week. I sit there, sometimes for an hour, just talking to her the way I did every evening for 44 years. And I tell her, more often than I probably need to, that I finally understood. That I finally trusted what she was trying to tell me, even though it took losing her, and then very nearly losing far more than money, to actually hear it. I think about those 5 words constantly now. Don't trust our son, Walter. Not because I stopped loving Michael. I never did, and I don't think I ever could have. But because I finally understood what Evelyn had known for months before she said it. That love and trust aren't the same thing. That you can love someone completely and still need to protect yourself and everyone else who depends on you from the consequences of loving them uncritically. If this story resonated with you, if someone you love has ever tried to warn you about something you weren't ready to hear, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Michael finally told his own children the full truth about what nearly happened to their grandfather's savings, that's a story too. Let me know. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.